us your proposal for dealing with the health information muddle. We've heard from a number of speakers today, this is not as easy a problem as you might think. There are all sorts of thorns and difficulties involved with privacy, security, being led down false trails, and so on. So give us your idea, just in short order, and we'll talk about it a little bit.
Sure. Well, the challenge was, how do we enable the health information economy? And if you look at healthcare, I think we talked about this earlier on. There's huge potential here. There's huge potential for how information can transform healthcare. And we're doing some of that now. But most of the investment in health IT has been predominantly focused on two things. One, achieving efficiencies, back office and front office efficiencies, using IT to do the types of things that we've done in the past in all these other sectors and we failed to do in healthcare. Mm-hmm. The other thing is, how can we use IT to give doctors the right information at the right time for the right patient? But there's something I think a lot bigger out there. And I think when you look at those first two things, that's going to be a small piece of the pie compared to how we can use health information and health IT to generate new knowledge, to do knowledge discovery, and to do medical research. And that's why I think having this vibrant health information economy is so important. So I think there's two challenges that might...
So when you say that drug discovery, we could see entire population sets, data sets, for example,
exactly,
mined for lessons on what drugs work after exposure, what are the drug-to-drug interactions, something like the Vioxx tragedy, where a very effective drug for a subset of the population was pulled, right, because we didn't know how to tell who those people would be. We might be able to get to a world where it's allowed for the right subset of people.
Exactly, right. Exactly. There's really two challenges here that I think I try to address in the proposal. One is the challenge of how do you collect and use data at the personal level for individuals? How do you aggregate that data at the personal level? And how do you do it at the national or population level? So to go for the first part, how do you do it at the personal level? That's what I have this proposal in here about using health record data banks. It's this idea of, the parallel would be in the financial industry, mint.com. How do you take all these different pieces of data and bring it together into one aggregated picture so you can do interesting things with it? And so using health record data banks, that's a way of setting up the right kind of incentive structure, the right kind of organizational structure, so that you can go out and aggregate this information. It sets the right kind of structure so you can have competition in this environment, you can have innovation within this environment.
But just to be clear, I mean, there are products in the market. You can go to Microsoft or Google and ask your doctors to submit their medical records or upload your own blood pressure readings at home.
Right.
But that's not what you're proposing. Yours is different. Just tell us briefly how it's
different.
Right,
so this goes beyond that. This is about creating a single authoritative source of health information that the user controls. It really changes the model from, we heard today earlier about how, it's really the health industry telling you what to do with the data.
Right.
This is about empowering the consumer. The health record data bank answers to the consumer. They don't answer to the doctor. They don't answer to the health insurers. They don't answer to anyone else but the consumer. That's their customer. And we can even create a fiduciary responsibility there, where that is who they're looking out for in terms of security and privacy. And if you have competition, then you have great incentive structures in place so that all these different actors can really try and do the right thing.
So do you see private companies running these, or would this be not-for-profits? Who would do this?
That's what's great about it. It can be anyone. So you can have Google, and you can have the people that say, Google's terrible. You can have EFF or Epic create their own. You can have AARP create their own.
Right.
You can have all these different players create the right kind of health record data bank for different types of people. You can have that kind of competition and choice.
Why would I trust any of these people? At the moment, it has not taken off for Microsoft. It's taken off even less for Google.
Right.
So what's different about your proposal? Would it be, for example, it would come with new protections on privacy or data portability, for example? How would you, what do you propose on the policy side, perhaps?
Right, so that's when you start getting at the national level, because I think, the big risk is you don't want to just aggregate the data and then you have all these data silos where the data is not used.
Exactly.
That's a failure.
That would be worse than where we are.
That'd be worse. Well, I don't know if it's worse. Right now we're trying to get the data from analog to digital. We're succeeding in that. We need to bring it together to the people, and then we need to bring it together at the national level. So at the national level, there's a lot of policies, actions, and levers that we can do to get us there. One is about giving users control of the data. Right, so it's about them saying to doctors, this information belongs to the patient, and saying, so one thing we can say is, after a certain point, we're not going to make doctors go back and digitize all their health records. That's obviously ridiculous. But we can say, in June 2012, after that point, after every healthcare encounter that you have, you can get all of that data that's generated in electronic format.
Right.
And that's kind of
meaning I, as the patient, must have access to digital
right.
versions.
I must have access to it. You
Right.
can say to health record data banks,
Sure.
you have to have data portability. You have to allow users to share their data with anyone that they want, any app, any researcher. It goes beyond that.
Right.
The second thing you want to do is you have to, I think, really, we didn't need the knowledge that there is a kind of collective responsibility that we have with data in the health environment. So there's a necessity, I think, that some data is going to be used. We do that today already, right? So there's certain personally identifiable information that is released if you have an infectious disease, right? And so we can go a little bit beyond that. We can say for certain federally funded research, for drug safety, for example, your data will be used in a controlled environment. We can debate what those controls are, but we can have that.
Right.
We can also say, if we're using anonymized, aggregated data, that we can have an opt-in system, that we can have an approval process, for example, through HHS or NIH, where researchers can come to them and say, we want to use the data, it goes through an evaluation process, and it's approved so that they can use national level data sets, right? And so I really think you do need choice here, right? I don't believe you should make people do things as much as possible. So what you do is you create an incentive structure, and you say, everyone has a responsibility to do that. If you opt out, there is going to be a consequence, though. If you're opting out, that means you're still taking advantage of all the research that goes on in healthcare. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, then we won't give you, for example, a federal tax break on your health insurance, employer-provided health insurance. Or maybe you're going to be last in line then for federally funded drug trials. And that's a way, it's similar to what we have with organ donation.
So carrots and sticks a little bit.
Exactly.
Now, this question of incentives is so important. When the other countries have looked at trying to move towards electronic medical records, the UK, for example, very famously has completely bungled a multi-billion-pound effort to move towards a digital medicine, in part by not consulting and including doctors in their surgeries and making it practical for them to transition. We've seen in the US as well a number of systems where there's been a lot of pushback. We have very, very low rates of adoption amongst individual family doctor practices of electronic medicine. The Obama administration has actually included billions of dollars of, in effect, bribes for the nation's doctors as well as hospitals, but especially the doctors, to migrate over to electronic records. So there's just the sheer money that's coming in the US to adopt electronic records. You're talking about micropayments, in a sense, at the level of individual transactions.
Exactly.
Getting a doctor or whatever, the office administrator, an incentive to file my electronic record with a company or with one of these banks.
Right. So the way health IT works right now, there's an asymmetry between the cost and the benefits. Doctors are paying for all the technology. Patients and insurers are the ones who get all the benefits, right? So what the health record data bank model does is it creates these incentive payments. So you go to the doctor, and the doctor makes a deposit of information. When they make a deposit of information about your healthcare encounter, they receive a small payment.
Right.
And the payer pays for this. There's been some market research saying that patients are willing to pay for access to their electronic health records. We saw yesterday Apple announced the iCloud, where for $25 a year you can have anytime, anywhere access to your entire music collection. Would you pay $25 for your health record? Full-time access to it? I think a lot of people would. And that's, it's very powerful when you start talking about unlocking that data, giving users control over that data, and giving them the incentive to start engaging with different players in the ecosystem.
Okay, so a very intriguing proposal. Let's bring out our panel of experts. We'll talk a little bit more about this and broaden out the conversation, and bring in the bring in the crowd as well. So let me introduce our panelists on this health information technology, really the future of medicine. Please come on out as I call out your names. Let's have Mike Driscoll, co-founder and CTO of MetaMarkets. Daniel Kraft, who is a man who wears many hats, among them Stanford University, Singularity University in telemedicine, and also Tim O'Reilly, a great friend of the Ideas Economy and known to many of you, who's the head of O'Reilly Media. Welcome. Please give him a round of applause. So, my distinguished panelists, what do you think of our winner? What do you think of his idea? You're all both data or health tech gurus. But why don't we start with you, Daniel? What do you think of this proposal, the practicality of it?
Well, I think the practicality is going to emerge, especially now when these exponential arenas of ability to capture data and analyze it and apply AI. From the physician hat that I wear, it'd be amazing to have this sort of eventual dashboard of all this related data. Again, it's not just going to be our vital signs and our blood pressure and our lab data. Maybe integrating our social networks when we want to open our privacy portals. It'll be data ported from our phone. I like to use the analogy that I think fits in with this of sort of the OnStar system for the body. It's going to be multiple sensors and data streams that will potentially turn on the little red light of your car or of your body. That means it's time to get a checkup or see your mechanic. And I think these sort of data sets, when integrated smartly, can allow the clinician and the patient to be participatory and share in that responsibility.
Tim, you've thought a lot about this issue. What do you think?
Well, I think the key issue in any forward-looking projections is that you're almost always wrong about the details. So.
But you can't be paralyzed by that, right?
Yeah, absolutely not. I mean, so you can absolutely say this is completely on trend.
Right.
This is the direction in which we're going to succeed.
Right.
But exactly, how that future is going to unfold and what are going to be.
You can also work out what's completely crap, right? I mean, what we don't want to do.
Yeah,
perhaps.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I mean, no question that there's an enormous opportunity to revolutionize healthcare with data. I mean, right now it is an absolutely broken system. I don't remember if this number is exactly right, but somebody told me that something like 1/3 of lab reports are never read by anybody, in the US. That's pretty astonishing. And the reason is they go into a paper file, and if the patient doesn't, the tickler is the patient coming back. And, if the patient doesn't come back, nobody looks, So just so many things like that you go, oh my God, that's like low-hanging fruit. And then you start looking at where we're going with, the quantified self stuff, and you say, oh, it's all going to come pretty much as you've outlined it.
What do you think about this, Mike?
I think the first step is just gathering the data. We've got all these instrumented systems that now make it possible and easy. You talk about these exponential forces. The cost of compute, storage, and bandwidth has fallen so much, and we've seen how that's affected a lot of other verticals. I think it's time that this really has an impact on healthcare. I think the next step will really be what we do with, beyond just managing and gathering the data, is analyzing it. There's been a lot of talk about predictive analytics. Certainly, many of us use navigational devices in our cars to help us get to where we're going. And there's a lot of statistics that's involved in helping route us to where we're driving. And I think we're going to see the rise of more, I hope, statistical techniques, more predictive analytics in the healthcare vertical now that we've got these new sources of data through these instrumented systems.
How will, sorry, go on.
Just to riff on the theme of a GPS or of the car, when you have a destination, whether it's your health or a treatment plan, and using the quantified self-data that's now emerging, it makes the individual and the clinician much more able to stay on path and get to your destination. And to the point about lab data, often the lab data we get is sort of out of context. It's a little number for your PSA or your cholesterol. It's not contextualized around you. So by being able to put that number within the crowdsourced information and context, for example, Thomas Getz at Wired did a great study and is expanding upon just putting your data in context and colors and context can make you have much better insight and change your behavior pattern by seeing that data, having that dashboard of where you're going on the map.
What's the risk, or how do we manage the problem of data overload? This has been a topic all day, but especially in healthcare, and I used to be our healthcare correspondent for a number of years at The Economist and talked to lots and lots and lots of doctors, as well as people in hospital administration and so on. Hospitals love IT, but it's all in the back office, right, in the back end. Doctors, they love perhaps gadgets and gizmos, but they're quite wary about this data deluge, and if you're anywhere above 35. And so the conceptual notion of evidence-based medicine, for example, is so elegant, it's so beautiful, that's how we should do medicine. But the practicality, especially as the pace of science advances, we haven't talked too much about genomics yet, there's going to be an explosion, perhaps even bigger than in other industries in health, of just simple data points. Making sense of that, the filters become all the more important. What technologies, what companies are building those better filters, to use Clay Shirky's analogy?
Yeah, well, I think we have to jump ahead to the next panel and just say there are going to have to be a lot of data scientists hired by healthcare companies, and it's going to happen. I think, one of the things you can look at in the progress of technology is that techniques that are developed in one industry end up having application in others. And we are building out on the consumer internet a kind of sensibility for dealing with data. We're building a workforce that knows how to deal with large amounts of data in real time. And those people are now looking for new opportunities, and a good number of them are going to land in healthcare because they're going to go, oh my God, this is a dinosaur of an industry that we can go revolutionize. And it's a hell of a lot more interesting than revolutionizing shopping.
So I'll put my doctor hat on, and as I trained in internal medicine, and let's just take the too much information problem. So let's say you're all my primary care patient, you all have high blood pressure and high cholesterol, and I want to pick the right statin and blood pressure regimen for you. I have a huge number of choices. I trained at MGH. I have my MGH version versus my Stanford version. And just right now, it's sort of off the shelf, one size fits all, very empiric. The cycles for having feedback are pretty much non-existent. But not only do I have potentially the ability to use your genomics and your pharmacogenomics, which dramatically change your drug selection or choice of therapy, your body surface area, how much wine you drink, the other drugs on. It's way too much for a clinician to integrate in their mind today. And while there's some tools for helping on diagnostics, there's not very many yet on decision support. How do I pick the right drug and the right dose for you? And some of those opportunities I think will layer in with this information. So it won't just be about having your medical record, but how to sort of dive into that from the clinical perspective.
But don't you think, Daniel, there'll be some particular startup that will end up focusing on a particular problem with deep analytics, and then sell that service? You know, so it's not going to be just like one size fits all solution.
Well, some are, like Archimedes, which spun out of Kaiser because they have all deep Kaiser data, will crunch the data of the patient overnight before their visit and help pick the right regimen the next morning. So that's starting, and then they can dive into that data later and crowdsource it and see what really worked and hone the cycle.
I want to turn to the audience in just a couple of minutes, so please start getting together your questions. I want to press a little bit on genomics. It's been mentioned a couple of times. Daniel, I think you've been a big advocate of the view that not only are we moving towards an inexpensive genome, $100 genome, but ultimately may even be free. But what I know so far, other than sort of fun spit parties at Davos with sort of the 23andMe crowd, the impact, real-world impact, has been relatively small of genomics. A huge amount of promise, especially when we look at the pharma industry or biotech.
I don't know. Quoting Ken Olsen in the early days of the personal computer, genomics is just a toy.
Right. So is it simply the question of it's going to take a lot longer than investors had hoped or boosters had hoped?
Well, I think we mentioned that the price has fallen at a double exponential. It's about less than $5,000 today, probably $100 within a couple of years, to the point where almost everyone's going to have it done. Just like we have our cell phones are essentially for free and pay for the service, those sort of companies are going to start mining the data. Again, it's not the data, it's trying to understand it with the right analytics and the tools to make it actionable. And when we're at the point where we're crowdsourcing all this information, have the genes available, just take my field of, I trained in oncology. Every tumor is essentially different. We're now at the point, like at Stanford, we're sequencing tumors. You can pull out immense amounts of data for that. So there's several projects at the Broad, and et cetera, doing cancer genomics. And you can start to pull that out either on the malignancy side or on even the individual side, and then have layered on top of it all the phenotypic information, which is your behaviors, your environmental data. Then it starts to get really powerful, and it's just at the beginning stage.
Can I just bring up one issue, which is the structural incentives in the healthcare system are really critical to get right. And this is one of the things that a lot of people don't understand about the Accountable Care Act. It really does have provision for a lot more experimentation. Because one of the things, of course, that we...
That, of course, is the new healthcare legislation that came into force. Yeah.
We, on the consumer internet, for example, we expect a free-for-all where people can have some wild-ass idea and go after it and, make money at it. And, we really, in our healthcare system is much more structured, and so there are things that just aren't going to get paid for. And we really do need to change that so that people can try more experiments. And so I think, the one thing that will hold this all back is the way in which we manage reimbursement for healthcare. And I think there is some great thinking on this going on at the Department of Health and Human Services. And it's ironic that the people who are, trying to tear a hole in the new healthcare legislation are the people who are saying, well, we want there to be more of a market. Well, guess what? This is what will get you more of a market if you'll just let it happen.
Let's turn to the audience. Let's have the lights up, please. And as ever, make your presence known. Let's see if we get some questions here. Has the brilliance of the panel dazzled you into silence? I can't believe it. There's a courageous gentleman here near the front. Let's have your question, sir.
Hello, Dr. Carl Hurd from Carson City, Nevada. I had a quick question about the ability to monitor effects, cause and effects within populations of not only medications, but of food sources and other sorts of marketing-based interventions in populations. And if anybody's actually looked at this as a possibility. In other words, the tax structure or the free market forces that currently drive costs of goods could be fundamentally upturned by looking at those things that are inserted into a population, such as food sources, and making those proportionate to the health consequences within that population, and how that might inform the regulatory environment. I wanted to see if anybody had given this some thought or if there were some ideas out there on that.
Any thoughts, Tim?
Wouldn't it be nice? I mean, I've actually been thinking about this question of what could government do that would be profoundly different. And the idea came up of a kind of algorithmic regulation. You know, what we are dealing with large-scale problems. There is a lot of information, but we're still, in thinking about it, you know, our model of regulation is that somebody, you know, an agency, whatever, writes a big pile of paper, and then a set of people read it, and then they try to implement it from there. And you try to imagine, what if Google fought spammers that way? You know, by doing an investigation, you know, that took 18 months and issued a report at the end of it. You know, it wouldn't work. You know, you have to actually do this stuff in real time. And I think, you know, when you're talking about that, you know, we're not going to get there unless we really can start to have more of a market-based economy around those things, and a market that's not controlled by people whose economic interest is to make us unhealthy. Because right now, the people who care about making us unhealthy have a lot more sway than the people who care about making us healthy.
Any follow-up?
You know, I think it's a very interesting idea around whether we can connect some of the consequences of diet and health decisions to McDonald's, for instance, putting a cheaper Happy Meal on the menu. I think we're still a long ways off from being able to connect those consequences to the actual. But
there are some.
Events.
Like, we subsidize corn syrup, which is probably the single most health-destructive policy that we have, you know, in this country.
Sure.
I think that the obvious sort of perverse subsidies are easy to do.
Yeah.
The causation or the causal link is tougher.
Yeah.
Between eating a cheeseburger and particular outcomes, right?
Right.
That's
but you know, the thing that's really interesting when you look at the role of things like crowdsourcing, you know, we can see the future in startups like Patients Like Me, you know, where a group of people who really, really care about understanding the impact of different treatments are just doing it themselves. And that's what inspires me, because when you see hackers, and when I use hackers in the broadest sense, when you see people who are enthusiasts, people who are doing it not for money, not because they're entrepreneurs, not because they think this is the next big thing, kind of delving into an area, you know, it usually means that there's a real revolution coming. And there are people, you know, whether it's the quantified self people or you know, people like, or in the Patients Like Me sort of study groups where they really have a life-changing disease and they need to deal with it, you know, where people are taking control of their own health in the same way that, for example, back in the days of the Homebrew Computer Club, people were saying, wow, we can actually have computers for ourselves.
Right.
They're saying we can take control of our own healthcare. And once that revolution starts in the minds and hearts of individuals, it spreads. And then the entrepreneurs come along to feed that ecosystem. So I think we are at the beginning of a system in which that will happen, but it won't come from top down, and it won't come from,
Just layering on the point with the government, the HHS is opening up with data.gov a lot of those data streams and these hacker conventions to get together. How do you leverage and make smart apps around health-related data, whether that's knowing the incidence of some disease in your neighborhood or what your school system is doing?
Speaking of such things, HHS is having a health data event tomorrow, which is going to be live streamed. I don't remember the URL for the live stream, but if you're interested, watch it.
So this is Manu Prabhakar from Cisco Systems. The quick question is, you know, this went back to the debate we had before as well. So there is like, in the private sector, we have Googles of the world, right, which have all this technology. And then in the public sector, we have all this what we want to achieve, but we don't have anything that is structured around it. So the most fundamental question is, how can you go about actually creating the same market forces coming into the public sector? Or probably the federal government or something like that works for the good, right? Privacy, right for healthcare, right for your privacy. So all those things get tied back together to the same big question, right? How do you leverage that to this?
Any takers?
I mean, to my understanding, the Obama administration has created some strong financial incentives for, we now have the ability to measure outcomes for a lot of different health providers, and I think there are some financial incentives built into the recent legislation that does actually give financial performance bonuses to providers who can bring a metric up or bring a level of morbidity or mortality down for
and there's no question that some of the forward-looking insurance companies are all over this stuff. And I do think that there are starting to be economic incentives where the insurance companies do see the opportunity to sort of restructure the way they pay for care. And some of them are pretty excited by it.
So the fundamental problem I've argued on our pages in the U.S. healthcare system is a misalignment of incentives. So the gentleman's right to point that out. We pay by piecework, right? It's a transactional reward system rather than paying for outcomes. Or as Michael Porter argued controversially about healthcare, paying for value and outcomes, but which sort of gets at the same idea. It's difficult because we have a fragmented system where often, my expense is your income. And so the example of the diagnostics tests that aren't even read, guess what? Quest is making a lot of money on those unread diagnostics. And so there are very strong political interests for not changing as well. So that's why I think you have to look at the system in the round. And if you were to move towards aligning incentives towards outcomes.
The CEO of Quest is outraged by statistics like that. He was saying to me, look, I want, it's like the fact that we don't get our lab tests back for 2 or 3 days. This is nuts. In some, quote, third world countries, they can get it in half an hour. They were doing a project out of Uganda doing testing, and they were literally getting it live back in half an hour. He says, why aren't we doing that here?
And frankly, if anyone who's visited some of the more advanced developing countries, India being a great example, they're leapfrogging ahead on health information data systems, integrating solutions, not just Apollo, which is a well-known case, but numerous examples, including reaching into the not just the elites of the society, but into lower demographics with mHealth, mobile-based solutions. So I think we're seeing it in Rwanda. So there's tremendous dynamism. I saw a couple of other hands. I saw a lady there. Let's get a microphone in the middle of the back here. And why don't we get a couple more? I saw a hand way in the back. We'll go there next. And back there as well, where I'm pointing for the third. Let's take 3 questions in a row. Short and sweet, please, and we'll have the panel respond.
So I love this conversation because
please
there's
identify
so
yourself.
much. Oh, sorry, Sonia Arison. I write about technology, and there's so much information now available to consumers, medical information, and the crowdsourcing websites, and all the gadgets that we can use to collect our own data, and the potential medical records that might actually work, getting doctors to give us some of our data back. But how do we manage that industry? How does that industry manage the impulse of the established medical associations and the people who want to protect consumers from knowing too much about themselves? The people who make the argument that, oh, well, you can't find out whether or not you have this gene or not because you can't find out on your own because it might disturb you. You have to get it through a doctor. I mean, how do you?
So you mean sort of the established guilds or the medical associations and so on that defend perhaps existing interests, however well-intentioned?
Exactly.
Okay, that's a clear question. Let's go to the back there. I saw a hand way in the back row. And the third microphone will go over here where I saw a hand in the back. Again, it's a very rare conference where people in the back get the microphone so often. So if people closer to the middle or front, just shout or something.
The oxygen's better for thinking back here.
There you go.
Armando Fox from Berkeley. Regarding your comment about we pay for piecework and it's a fragmented system, I wonder if any of the panelists have an opinion on, in the US, the Veterans Administration system actually is not organized that way. Their economic model is actually based on, minimizing dollars spent for a given outcome, and they actually do very well on a lot of metrics. And they've been collecting electronic patient records since the 80s, before it was glamorous, and they actually can do and have done evidence-based medicine based on real longitudinal studies. So is this a model we should be looking at? Do we already sort of know how to solve this problem and we need to just technology transfer the solution, or are there fundamental ingredients still missing from there?
So we may need to learn what we already know, right? So that's a good example. Let's get the third question in, and then we'll finish off with our panelists.
Don Tapscott, I raised this issue earlier, and I'd just like to get a reaction. The concept of collaborative healthcare. And it strikes me that this is a good discussion, because most of the discussions we have about healthcare fall within the paradigm, if you like, of the industrial model, where I'm a clinician, I have knowledge, you're a patient, you're a recipient of the system, and you don't have knowledge, and you're inert, and I deliver health care to you. Well, we know that the #1 risk factor in health is actually isolation. And we have all these big problems like obesity. How are we going to solve this problem? A quarter of women who have cesareans in the United States have one because they're morbidly obese. I mean, we need to somehow find a way to engage patients. And we have patients
Don,
like,
your question is, how do we engage patients better or to inform them?
Well, no, I'd like to get a reaction to the idea of moving towards a collaborative model. So everybody gets a website, there's a social health or social network for healthcare. You have control over your own record, you have transparency into the record, and this is a foundation for science.
I mean, I've stacked the deck. I don't think anyone on this panel would disagree with that, but let me maybe let's start with that question and push it a little bit. The collaborative model that Don's written so eloquently about, you guys have all followed. How do we get from here to there?
Part of it's simply the incentive structure and adding some of the elements we heard about earlier, even gamification of health. If you're incentivized to walk farther with your Fitbit and have more health points and compete against your friends or tweet your weight, and at the end of the month your healthcare premium is lowered, or your friends know and you leverage your social network. The whole book Connected talks about how if your friends are obese, you're more likely to be obese, and those things can be leveraged backwards as well. So part of it is having that insight, having some of those numbers in your face, and potentially building smart incentives around teams, data, gamification, and also having that communication with your physician, which, back to the other question, is if the system encourages it, like Kaiser, where you can email your doctor and they sort of get paid for it as part of their job, versus most HMOs where they don't get reimbursed for email or doing a Skype session, therefore you don't do that. So if the incentives are aligned both like within a Kaiser or VA to keep people on the preventative side, as well as you incentivize the person to stay fit, it helps.
I also think there's an aspect that's not technology here. If you look at the work that Paul Farmer does, right. You know, this is
at Partners for Health.
Yeah, Partners is engaging people. You know, I watched it. He showed this very inspiring film about some of their work in Haiti, where there were people who were victims from the earthquake who they trained to be healthcare workers. You know, it's like, so here are these young girls, you know, walking out on artificial limbs to help counsel other people who are getting their artificial limbs. Right. You know, it's like they took them from being victims to being employees, right. You know, and part of it's like going, okay, well, how much training do you need to tell somebody to take their pills, or to do physical therapy, or to check up on people? And it's really just a different healthcare model. That's because they didn't have physicians. They said, well, what can we turn over to people? And I do think there's a lot where we are imagining too much of technology, and we need to build a new social fabric around health.
Or return to an earlier social fabric. Let's get to the second question in reverse order. The question about the VA. Anyone have an opinion on this? Certainly, the VA was very early with IT systems. I know that, and Kaiser as well, which has been mentioned, has an integrated health system with IT.
I think it's a great example. My wife's actually a surgical oncologist, and she, during her medical school, would rotate through different systems. And I always told her, keep your eyes open for what works and what doesn't. And she found the VA system to be excellent. I think if you think what that really represents is standards. And one of the things that governments do very well is establish standards. That's what's missing, I think, in the healthcare space right now. These standards can't be fragmented and different. And I think the VA has established a pretty good base case.
But the VA also does have different financial incentive structure than the rest of healthcare.
It does, and also
that's a big part of the difference.
And again,
Kaiser's another example.
It also has restrictions on which drugs can be used, which some in America would consider un-American or socialist or death panels or whatever. But it is not a free market where any and all of the latest expensive therapies are available to everyone. And so that might argue for thinking again about an American example of what might work. We have 1 minute. I want to make sure to address the other question that was asked. How do we manage the AMA or the traditional interests? Someone want to offer a short and sweet response? We just have 1 minute on, maybe since you've been thinking about Washington solutions, how do we handle established interests who want to defend the status quo?
Well, I think technology gives us many opportunities to do away with things. You know, we move from the
Nuclear
model of doctor knows best,
right.
and now patient sometimes knows best, and sometimes the data knows best, and we just want to get to that point where these institutions aren't the leaders. It's really about the data. It's about the analysis, and it's about creating the right kind of structure so you can go out and do this knowledge creation and get those answers.
Okay, so we come back to knowledge is power. Thank my panel very much, including our InnoCentive winner, for your contributions. Thank you very much.